fish and chips.
A staple of British cuisine. Across the nation, you can find this delicacy at every street corner, ranging from pubs, fancy restaurants, or even chippies, which are so specifically assigned for this meal.
But how much do Britons actually love the oil-scorched carcasses of cod?
Well enough to go to war over it with Iceland, our Nordic neighbour who we have to share the sea with. Iceland in of itself has a deep culture of fish, considering that this is the #1 export besides unpronounceable names.
British and Icelandic fishing disputes began before Iceland was even its own nation. Iceland used to be a Danish colony with its own king until World War II. In the 14th century, more and more fishermen were going to the waters surrounding Iceland as there was an abundance of white gold. The Icelandic king Eric III took a notice to this and wasn't very happy about the depleting cod stocks, since it meant that he couldn't have his fish fingers for lunch anymore. So he decided to do something radical to solve the situation. In 1414, he banned all trade between Iceland and England. In order to better their relations, King Harry V of England passed a legislation to restrict English fishermen from going to the waters surrounding Iceland. However, there was just a few small issues. The legislation went unenforced, meaning that there was no consequences for breaking this law, so the fishermen could not give less of a crap and kept fishing. Iceland couldn't really do much about it, and English fishermen had free reign over the Nordic cod.
In the 1800s, with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, steam power became a lot more widely available, and so steam-powered boats came into existence. This gave the incentive for the British fishermen to take Iceland's cod supply at a much more efficient rate. The Danish government, which controlled Iceland at the time, was not very happy about this, and so would impose a 50-mile exclusive fishing area, which also included the Faroe Islands that are very close to Scotland. But how did the British fishermen react to this? Well, just like the last time Ontario imposed fishing restrictions, and did not give less of a shit and just kept fishing. The British government also did not acknowledge this claim, as they were worried that soon enough more Nordic countries would follow and further damage their fishing industry. Soon enough, the Danish coast guards began arresting the British trawlers, and the British government felt like they needed to do something about this. And so, we sent out the Royal Navy in what would be a naval dick measuring contest. This was at the time when the British Empire was at its peak, and the Royal Navy was the largest naval force in the whole world. So it doesn't take much guessing as to who won the contest. The message was clear: let our trawlers fish in your seas, or else. The Danish did not have much of a choice, so they were obliged. But in 1901 they did manage to come to a compromise, when the British government acknowledged that they will have exclusive fishing rights for up to 3 miles of their coastlines, which also included their territories.
When World War II came about, Denmark, which still controlled Iceland, declared itself to be neutral, but the Germans invaded it anyway, and took over in 6 hours. Iceland did not have an army, nor a naval force, so was left defenseless. Britain sent their army to take over the Danish territories before the Germans could get there. Once on the island, the Icelanders did not show much resistance, and pretty much allowed them to take over the island. The Icelanders often referred to World War II as the Blessed War, since they were one of the few countries to actually come out better after the war. The British and Americans positioned on the island created better infrastructure, and Iceland, for the first time in its history, got a taste of what it would be like if they were an independent nation. The Icelanders took a liking to this, and so in 1944 held a referendum to whether they should be an independent nation. The poll result came to a whopping 98.4% of the population voting in favour of breaking away from Denmark. After World War II ended, Britain's army left Iceland, leaving all the airfields and bases to them, and the American army signed a contract in 1946 that in 6 months they would leave the country, but they never did. Later we'll find out how this actually worked out in Iceland's favour. Inspired by Norway's dispute with the United Kingdom, Iceland decided to follow in their footsteps of adding an extra mile to the sea border, creating a 4-mile fishing limit instead of 3 on the 15th of May in 1952. The day this was implemented, the Grimsby Telegraph dubbed it the darkest day the British fishing industry has ever known. While this may seem like an exaggeration, we also have to look at the implications of what this meant. Other than, of course, the British trawlers being limited by another mile of less cod-rich fishing ground, this also meant that they could no longer seek refuge in the bay surrounding Iceland during bad weather conditions. Now the skippers had to plan in advance to whether it was even safe to go out fishing during particularly stormy weather. The increase in distance also came with a lot of consequences for the Icelanders, as now the British fishing industry has banned all Icelandic caught fish from being sold in British port towns, and also blacklisted anyone who bought the fish. This was devastating for the Icelanders, and it all makes sense once you look at the economy at the time. 3% of the total output came from agriculture, 7% from industrial manufacturers and others, 15% from a single aluminium smelter, and over 75% from fishing alone. Having lost one of the main buyers, the future of Iceland is uncertain. The Soviet Union caught wind of this and decided to step in and buy the Icelandic fish. America, fearing that one of their allies in a very strategic location might side with the communists, urged European nations like Spain and Italy to buy the cod. The United Nations were in the talks of setting out the official sea border for its nation, and Iceland grew very excited by this, and so would go on to impose a 12-mile sea border, which will further anger the already very angry British, and the events that will lead to the First Cold War.
The sea was, and to some degree still is, considered a vast and lawless space that nobody owns and is free to open exploitation. The United Nations wanted to bring order to the Wild West over the seas and hosted the first international conference on the law at sea. While at the conference, the representatives of different nations discussed what should be the official sea ownership for each nation. Some members opted for a 12-mile limit, but that was just a talking point. Nothing was set in stone.
This was enough conversation for Iceland, who on the 1st of September 1958 imposed a very 12-mile sea border, despite both NATO and Warsaw Pact nations opposing it.
Iceland to this day does not have a navy, so how on earth were they going to impose this? Well, at the time they had about 6 gunboats, which made up for the coast guards, and the strength of law for the aquatic vertebrate, and God forbid anything that came in between. The British trawlers did not take the new imposed fishing limit very seriously at first. Whenever the coast guards would come to tell them to go away, they would just simply ignore the order and continue fishing. If the coast guards attempted to get too close to make an arrest, the trawlers would spray them with hot water and hurl any devastating projectiles they can get their hands on, like potatoes and sticks. But this deadly show of force still wasn't enough to keep the Icelanders at bay, so the trawling companies threatened to stop fishing unless the Royal Navy steps in to keep them safe. Since Britain decided they're not going to put up with the new expansion, they sent out 53 warships to protect the British trawlers in the area. An operation that was very costly, with Lord Carrington estimating that over £1 million was spent on oil for the ships alone. The warships were ordered to protect the trawlers by any means possible, other than opening fire on the coast guards. The Icelandic Coast Guards decided they're not going to put up with Britain's crap and went on to enforce the new 12-mile limit, whether they liked it or not. Even though the only boat that they had that could effectively carry out arrest and tow a trawler was the ICGV-4.
Undetermined by Britain's show of force, the Icelanders were doing the best they could to stop the British intruding on the seas by ramming their gunboats into the warships, shooting blanks at the trawlers to deter them if an arrest was not possible, and even at the Royal Navy when threatened hard enough. On one instance, 4 encountered a trawler fishing within the 12-mile limit, and after giving countless warnings, the skipper did not budge, so 4 had let off 2 blank rounds, and even a live round. HMS Russell came to assist the trawler, and his shipmaster requested that the Coast Guards leave the boat alone, since they're not on the 4-mile limit, which the British government approved on. Erica Christopherson, the captain of ICGV-4, told HMS Russell that it's simply not gonna happen, and that they will approach the trawler with the guns manned. HMS Russell then threatened that if even a single shot was fired, that they would be in full authority to sink the boat. Later on, more British warships arrived, and 4 had no choice but to retreat.
The news of the Royal Navy having set off their warships in Iceland's waters was not met very well by the Icelandic public, who displayed their anger by protesting outside America's military base in the region and the British embassy. Andrew Gilchrist was the British ambassador in Iceland at the time, decided it would be a good idea to show the protesters how skilled he was in playing the bagpipes, and to add insult to injury, he also blared out military marches on his gramophone. Iceland, while small in size, still had an ace up its sleeve. They warned America that if they did not reach a conclusion in their favour, that they would drop out of NATO and expel the American army from their soil, something that the Americans wanted to avoid at all costs, especially since they were using their base in Keflavik to monitor Soviet activity in the Nordic Sea. Thus, another United Nations Conference on the Lower Sea came into place, where they were now established that every country will officially own the sea 12 miles away from their coastlines.
Iceland and the United Kingdom came to an agreement in late February of 1961 that Britain will officially recognize the 12-mile naval border, but they will still get special fishing rights during certain areas and seasons for the next 3 years in up to 6 miles away from the Icelandic coast. From then on, both nations were happy, and it was all smooth sailing. Or was it? In the early 1970s, Iceland was in the talks of expanding their fishing limit zone from 12 to 50 miles. The reason for this expansion was quite simple. They depended on fish, and Britain was taking all of it. They were scared that by not having the means to fish in their own seas, their financial independence may be put in jeopardy, meaning that they would have to rely on other nations to remain independent. In addition, British trawlers were fishing to such a high degree that the cod stocks were at risk of disappearing once again. Initially, the Icelandic government wanted to go for a 200-mile exclusive zone, but they were worried that they wouldn't be able to patrol such a large area efficiently, and most of the cod-rich areas were in the 50-mile radius anyways. With such a noble cause as saving the fish from overfishing, you may think that the European countries and the United Nations Council may get behind it this time. No. It wasn't approved the first time, why would it be any different now? The United Kingdom was definitely not going to stand for it this time, especially since its fishing industry was a bigger threat than ever before, considering that they just joined the European Union. And at the time, the European Union just implemented the Common Fisheries Policy. This policy allowed them to restrict who and how much they can fish. The United Kingdom did not want other countries imposing restrictions on them, and wanted to maintain their fishing quotas. However, in a surprising turn of events, the Icelanders did get a lot of support from many African nations, as Johan Hafstein, the Prime Minister at the time, tried to turn this event into something bigger than a fishing dispute. Instead, he saw it as an existential struggle against the evil colonialism and imperialism of the West. After all, not too long ago, Iceland was a colony too. Iceland knew that protecting the newly assigned borders would not be an easy task, and they've been preparing. Iceland now had another patrol vessel, being the ICGV Ægir, and alongside it, a secret weapon which would catch the British trawlers by surprise, rendering the catches and time spent at sea completely useless. On the 1st of September 1972, the new sea border was put into place, and the Icelanders had to now defend it. The Ægir proved to be so effective that on its first day, it managed to make over 16 British and German trawlers to revert their course. The Icelandic Coast Guards were once again a force to be reckoned with, but the British trawlers just kept fishing. On the 5th of September, only 4 days after the new border was put into place, the Icelandic guard vessel Ægir was patrolling across the northern seas of Iceland when he came across an unregistered trawler. At 10:25 am, they first began making contact with the ship, politely asking them to identify themselves and to revert course. The skipper's reaction was to blast Rule Britannia over the radio. After 15 minutes of this, the Ægir decided it was time to use their special attack, and so for the first time, they dropped a modified net cutter into the sea. It was very effective. The Ægir drove past the trawler, initially leaving the fishermen confused as to why they didn't try to arrest or stop them. Once they pulled back their nets and realized what happened, it all clicked in. Some consider this tactic unsafe, with some fishermen raising the worry that these net cutters can cause serious harm and even slice a person into two. A German trawler had to endure the harsh consequences of fucking around and finding out when they kept fishing within the 50-mile exclusive zone. The Ægir dropped their blades into the sea and the net flung back, leaving the German fisherman with a severe head injury. Despite concerns, the net cutters became the weapon of choice for the Icelandic fish preservists. They were so effective that on the 18th of January 1973, 18 trawlers had their nets cut off. This now forced the fishermen to retreat from the 50-mile limit and asked the Royal Navy to step in. The very next day, the Royal Navy sent in the tugboats, but after realizing it would not be enough, they formed a special unit to protect the trawlers. Probably named them Division Chippies, but don't count me on that one. The trawler fleet later returned to the Icelandic seas accompanied by frigates and jets that let the trawlers know the location of the Coast Guards. Olafur Jóhannesson, the Prime Minister of Iceland at the time, was infuriated by this, and since they didn't have the means to take out the frigates, he asked Big Daddy USA to step in and bomb the Royal Navy. Nixon didn't start blasting the British warships, but this demand did worry him, especially since the Red Scare was in full effect, and he worried about the possibility about losing an ally in such a strategic location. Iceland was in the middle of the GI-UK gap, which they used to keep the Soviets away from the American seas. Nixon worried that if this heavily surveillance naval choke point was breached, the Russian spy submarines would get across, and therefore instead of it being American spying on Russian activity, it would be the Russian spying on American activity, which, by American standards, is not fair. It wasn't just Olafur who had enough of the Royal Navy, but also the Icelandic public, who heavily protested the British incursion of the seas. And since the last time they protested, the message did not go across very well, this time they decided to go for some more unconventional means to make sure their voices were being heard, and so proceeded to break every single window at the British Embassy in Reykjavik. The net cutters just weren't cutting it anymore, and the Icelandic Coast Guards knew that they had to step up the ante. The Ægir came across an unregistered trawler and asked it to surrender and be arrested. Once he refused, they began letting off blank rounds. These can still cause a lot of damage, but since the trawler still wasn't giving up, they even began firing live rounds in a cat and mouse game, where the trawler managed to escape to safety just in time. With tensions rising higher than ever before, and the threat of Iceland leaving NATO raised enough red flags to capture the attention of the world stage, NATO decided it was time for peace talks. Iceland's main concern was that NATO was not doing enough to protect them throughout the conflict, considering that one of the main NATO constitutions is to protect all members from invading forces, even from the ones within NATO, and should always side with the party who's under attack. The British fleet was requested to leave by October, and by November 8th an agreement took place where the British government will have to restrict the trawlers from fishing anything more than 117,000 tons of fish for the next 2 years. 9 months after the agreement took place, we'll have what was known as the CS Forester incident. CS Forester was the largest British trawler in the Nordic Sea, and he has just been spotted fishing within the 12-mile exclusive zone. Greed gets the best of us at times,
And the gunboat Ford decided it would be the one to punish Forrester for its sins. After Forrester refused to be apprehended, Ford began firing blank rounds, and thus a chase began. Ford and Forrester went at it for hours, covering over 100 miles in the process. But it all came to an end once Ford began firing live rounds, hitting Forrester in the engine room and the water tank. Forrester was then towed back to Iceland, where skipper Richard Taylor was sentenced to 30 days in prison and a £5,000 fine. Richard would surely be released after his company paid his bail of £2,232. The boat was also released after its owner paid an additional £26,300. The trawler was allowed to depart with the 200 tons of fish it caught, proving that with enough money, you too can bend fishing regulations to your will. In 1975, a third United Nations conference was held to discuss the borders of the sea. Many of the smaller nations wanted to go for 100-mile sea ownership from the coastlines. Since the UN was just as useless back then as they are now, this was all just talk. But not for Iceland, who began to worry about the diminishing cod stocks, since by 1970 there was an estimated 740,000 tons of the fish. But by 1975 this dropped to about 210,000 tons. And scientists predicted that if the trend continues, this would drop to about 50,000 tons by 1979. This was a very real worry, considering that at the time there was a crisis concerning the northern herring, since by 1958 there was about 8.4 million tons of the fish, but overfishing drastically dropped it to about 0.50 million tons by 1970. With these sorts of statistics, there's no room for negotiation, and while in the previous COD wars, the Icelandic government did give some leeway for the British by giving them specific fishing quotas, this time the scientists and the public put immense pressure on the Icelandic government to stop bending over backwards for the British. So, by 16th of September 1975, the fishing agreement between the United Kingdom and Iceland expired, and instead of going for the 100-mile sea border as proposed at the UN meeting, just like a gambler sensing that he's gonna make it big, Iceland said double or nothing, and went for 200 miles instead. And it's not like Iceland magically increased their fleet overnight, they still had the same gunboats that they used during the previous COD wars. However, they did try to purchase Asfield-class gunboats from the United States, and when they were told no, they then went to the Soviets and tried buying Merker-class frigates from them instead, which they denied as well. While they did not get a larger naval fleet, they sent a strong message to NATO, which made them worry about what can potentially come out of this incident, since they couldn't afford to lose such a strategic ally. The Icelanders had no issue ramming them as smaller gunboats into the Royal Navy, as they were quite easy to repair and will return back at sea in no time. The Royal Navy, while they did have the much bigger and scarier warships, they were also a lot more expensive, and therefore couldn't afford to damage them nowhere near as often. After about 15 frigates were damaged, and more than a few £100,000 done to draining repairs, the Royal Navy now opted for a more cautious approach, and would instead track the locations of the Icelandic gunboats, and let the trawlers know their whereabouts to avoid them. To combat this, the Icelandic Coast Guards would actually intercept radio communications being transmitted and record them. They would then play these recordings days later in order to confuse the trawlers as to where they really were, and be able to successfully carry out the arrest. Quite quickly, the Royal Navy caught wind of this, and so warned the trawlers when the Icelanders were playing false messages. But the Icelanders would record these messages again to confuse them further, where it got to the point where the fishermen did not know which broadcasts were real and which weren't. However, this conflict was dragging on for too long, and John Prescott, the MP of Hull East, would go to Iceland and try to negotiate a peace deal which would favour the British. The Icelandic government, while under immense pressure from the public for being too soft, knew that they would have to do something even more drastic to end it all. And so, Georg Hallgrímsson, the Prime Minister of Iceland at the time, announced that if the United Kingdom does not take the fleet out of the seas, that they're gonna end off public relations. Iceland kept their promise, and about a week later after the announcement, on the 19th of February 1976, Iceland ended all diplomatic relations with Britain. But this was not the end of it. The stubborn United Kingdom did not want to give up their sacred fish fingers and kept their fleet at sea regardless. Iceland, scrambling about for any possible solutions, decided to now use the last possible attack. While being a very democracy-loving, pro-Western country, they still told the Americans that they have to get lost from their base in Keflavik and that they will leave NATO unless they get an agreement in their favour. Wanting to keep the commies at bay, America finally intervened and pressured the British into taking a deal to end this marine malarkey. So, on the 2nd of June 1976, Iceland and Great Britain got together to sign the Oslo Agreement, which gave Iceland exclusive fishing rights over the 200-mile sea border which they now officially claimed. But to also keep the British happy, for a limited amount of time, they were also allowed to fish 30,000 tons within the 200-mile exclusion zone. Both sides were now in agreement and lived happily ever after. Or did they? The sport fishing industry, which was once a booming business, was now in its decline, and with the new agreement being put into place, the final nail was put in its coffin. As a consequence, many port towns such as Grimsby, Hull and smaller cities across England and Scotland came to financial ruin, as their reliance on the trade came to buy them back. The business owners had to now scrap or sell their trawlers to other countries, and the government did give them £35 million as compensation. But what about the cities in which the trade was its only means of financial prosperity, and the hard-working fishermen? After all, the government did promise that they would send in investors to diversify the trades, and also give the fishermen financial compensation and training. But this now raises the question, did they do it? Of course not. This is the government we're talking about. They say one thing and do another. The towns were left to rot and the fishermen were abandoned and impoverished. The trade only made up for 1% of the total economy, so the government saw it as something simply not worth their time. As for the fishermen, they were seen as casual workers, therefore the government thought that they were not worth redundancy pay. The fishermen were actually quite understanding of how the Icelanders reacted, as after all, they were reliant on fish from their coastlines. The blame for this catastrophe was solely placed on the British government.
In 1977, the National Federation of Fishermen's Organizations was formed, and it only took them 35 years of constantly harassing the parliament to get some sort of compensation. And so in 2012, the government gave 2,500 fishermen about £1,000 each, which wasn't great and came 35 years too late, but at least they managed to get something. Now what about the Icelanders? Everything seemed great for the former Vikings. I mean, after all, they won all 3 wars on their own terms and had over 300 miles of water to themselves, right? Well, now the Icelanders had to place restrictions on their own fishermen to avoid overfishing the cod, which they wholeheartedly fought over for 3 decades. In 2012, they even got into problems with other countries because of trawlers entering the seas to fish for mackerel. At the time, the fish were migrating to other seas in Europe, and ironically enough, the Icelandic fishermen were determined to meet their quotas, despite what the sea law said.
While nonetheless, this eventually paved the way for the modern sea law, it also showed the radical fish preservationists can achieve through sheer determination, and also why in the modern era, you can't just bully smaller nations and expect things to go your way.